Well, tonight we are going to participate, as Danny mentioned, in a series of public forums called One Just World, Think, Talk, Act on Global Poverty and Development. And tonight we are looking at a topic that is very close to all of your hearts, obviously, as you're here, feeding the world, land, hunger and human rights. Today we're very fortunate to have three esteemed guests who are here to share their insights with us about this important topic. Before I formally introduce them shortly, I'd like to welcome our speakers to take their seats on the stage. Now, in the interim, there is a bit of housekeeping we need to do. You know I'm going to say this, please turn your mobile phones on silent. You're welcome to leave them on though, because we'd really like you to participate in our online or conversation via Twitter. Now, you've received a little piece of paper, I hope. If it's not on your seat, it's on your neighbour's seat, so it's a good chance to reach over and say hello. Couple of things you need to do if you're going to take part in the Twitter exercise. It's a two-step process. So, you have the details on your piece of paper, but I'd just like to reiterate the two steps. The first one, to log into Wi-Fi, choose the network name that comes up, use SID guest. And the second step involves activating your browser. So you need to open up your browser then. A page will come up where you can log in. You also have a password. It's really important with the password to realise that that is a capital O and not a 0. So now, having done that, I will join our speakers and start the introductions. The first person I'd like to introduce is Kelly Dent. Kelly leads Oxfam Australia's Economic Justice team, working on their current food justice campaign called GROW. This campaign covers forced acquisition of land, small-scale producers, climate change and food price volatility. Kelly's portfolio also covers trade and investment and labour rights. In 2011, Kelly led the Oxfam International team at the UN climate talks in Durban, South Africa. And since 2009, she has been a key member of the Oxfam International delegation at each of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change intersessionals. Kelly has published and has campaigned internationally on labour rights, supply chain management, and business and human rights, issues on which she has extensive expertise and experience. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Dent. The second speaker on my left is Elizabeth Tongne. Elizabeth is the Executive Director of Wide Bay Conservation Association in Papua New Guinea, and she gets the prize for travelling the furthest tonight. Unless you can beat that, I challenge anybody. Elizabeth comes from a family of subsistence farmers in a remote village in the East New Britain province. We were told tonight that even if you manage to get to PNG, you'll have a 6-hour boat trip at some point to reach her province. As a traditional environmentalist, Elizabeth and her family have continuously sustained their lives through their relationship with the land on which they live and the resources which it provides. Elizabeth is a teacher by profession, and in the face of a traditional society that is changing very rapidly, she initiated Wide Bay Conservation Association to help facilitate people's thinking about active engagement in development and environmental sustainability. In recognition of her outstanding qualities, Elizabeth was awarded the Pride of PNG, a Courage and Bravery Award for women. Please join me in giving Elizabeth a very warm welcome. And our final speaker on the end, he travelled from Melbourne, so small peanuts. Thank you for being here, Michael. Michael Whitehead is the Director of Agribusiness Research with the ANZ Insights team. In this role, he focuses on mapping industry-based trends and analysing the impact of these sectoral changes and dynamics on stakeholders across the agribusiness sector. Prior to joining ANZ, Michael was the product specialist for Macquarie Agricultural Funds Management in New York, as well as Executive Director of Rabobank's Food and Agribusiness and Advisory team in North America. He has worked with the United Nations and the International Red Cross in Switzerland, as well as in regional economic development in Australia and China. He also has a background in agricultural production and consulting, particularly in Australia and China. And he's been featured widely in global media, including CNBC, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming Michael. So this evening is going to be a very interesting discussion, and in a moment I'm going to ask our three speakers to each kick off with about 2 or 3 minutes about the topic, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of open discussion between the four of us, followed by 30 minutes of questions from you. So I encourage you to be thinking about what you might ask our speakers. But first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit just about the topic tonight. Prompted by the 2008 food crisis, wealthy food importing nations are securing their future food supplies in poorer, resource-rich nations. One of the ways in which they are doing this is through large land-scale acquisition. The world's largest social movement, International Farmers' Organisation La Via Campesina, calls this practice land grabbing, a term which has now caught on in many forums. So serious is the situation that in March this year, the United Nations Committee on World Food Security adopted draft guidelines against land grabbing. Now, this is a very controversial topic. While supporters of foreign land investment initiatives do describe opportunities for technological development and increased yields that will feed local populations, other people argue that land deals are often made without consultation with local people, and that the impacts of ventures, including displacement, food insecurity and water shortages, are rarely considered in some of the deal making. In many cases, local people are unlikely to benefit from the investments, and the World Bank has provided some analysis that suggests that only 37% of foreign investment projects are in food crops. And all too often, the food that is not exported to the home countries of investors will be converted to bioethanol products produced from soya, palm, rapeseed, and other oil-rich plants, some of the staple foods of some of the poorest people in the world. So tonight we're going to ask a few prickly questions and try and discover whether these trends that we're seeing are taking food from the mouths of people who desperately need it and jeopardising food security. In what way are positive ventures improving the lives of those people? So this is a two-sided coin. How can we ensure that the world's food and fuel and income needs are taken care of without compromising the security rights and livelihoods of traditional landowners and some of the world's poorest? So hoping that we can gather some insights into this debate, I would like to turn to Kelly first of all and just ask her to kick off her 2-minute position statement on behalf of Oxfam, of course. Why is Oxfam concerned about land grabs, Kelly, and how do they have an impact on poverty?
Great, thanks Alana. I'd also, just before I do answer that question, like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on today and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So to go to the question, 1 in 7 people go to bed hungry every night. And why, in a world where we have enough to eat, do we see 1 billion hungry people or 1 in 7 people going to bed hungry? Hunger, along with obscene levels of waste, we see 30% of food wasted in Australia and indeed across the developed world as well as in developing countries, but obviously for very different reasons. These hunger, along with obscene levels of waste, exists because our food system is broken, and Alana spoke about some of those reasons. We've seen rising food prices, increasing scarcity of arable land and water, and a rapidly changing climate. It's also really important to note that 2/3 of the people in the world today who are hungry are small-scale producers themselves. So they're surrounded by food, but many still go hungry. And then when we talk about land, we have to remember that land is life, land is culture, land is identity, and land is people's livelihoods. The most recent debate on land grabbing has centred around the meteoric rise of large-scale land acquisitions, predominantly for the purposes of agribusiness. Now, I mean, foreign investment in land and land grabbing to some extent is not new, but what is new is the meteoric rise that we've seen in the last few years, which has set the conditions for large-scale land grabbing around the world. And this is obviously of huge concern, because the speed and the scale of these land grabs has meant that there's been no mechanisms to protect the rights of poor people. It's questionable investment with questionable benefits, this very large-scale land acquisition of agribusiness for agricultural purposes that's happening. The practice can involve forced evictions, destructions of livelihoods, and conflicts between local communities that can go on for years, which threaten people's livelihoods. And Oxfam, in its work around the world, working with partners, working with affected communities, working with people who are lobbying governments to change these laws, sees the impact of this on people and people's livelihoods every day. And I know Elizabeth will give a much more first-hand account of some of that. Even the World Bank is at a loss to point to a single example of this type of land grabbing that's good. And for this reason, we should see that we need a good response that's more than business as usual. I just make 2 more points. I think that if we want to know why we've seen this wide-scale land acquisition, I think we can attribute the phenomenal increase back to the food price crisis of 2007 and 2008. During that time, we saw many investors and governments turn their attention to agriculture because they were worried about a number of things, either food security for their own countries, or we saw speculation making money out of food commodity prices, and also because land is becoming a scarce resource, hanging on to that land to be able to make money later. And my final comment before I wrap up my 3 minutes is that I think land grabs of the current nature encourage a model of agricultural development that pushes small-scale producers off their land in return for investment by foreign investors, and this is often at rock-bottom prices. We often hear that investment is good for communities, that investment is good for jobs, but it's not if you're not given a say in that investment. If there are not enough jobs, if you lose your land, if you are forced to move from rural areas to urban areas to take up precarious employment and live in one of the ever-expanding slums that we're seeing around cities in the world today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. And turning to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you started up Wide Bay Conservation Foundation in response to the circumstances faced by your community, so you have first-hand experience of this. Can you please tell us a bit more about what's happening in Wide Bay and what measures have you put in place?
Thank you. Before I talk about what we have tried to do in our communities, I also would like to acknowledge the landowners of this land and also to acknowledge the Government of Australia for the support that they've given to us in Papua New Guinea. And also I'd like to bring greetings from our forest people to all of you. And so what I would like to say tonight is why we have actually started this organization is that we have actually seen a shift in the way our people, in the shift in the land use. That is, from a traditional society, people have actually depended on the land to land and to earn a living. And it has always been communal for them. Even if the land belongs to a clan, yet everybody in a community uses the land to actually earn their living. And the shift that have actually taken place now is that land is now given to big development projects, like in the case of where I come from, land has been given away for oil palm development, and previously for logging. And the fact here is it has not taken into care the social security that it would leave behind for communities who once lived and end their lives on the land. And so for us, we've tried to help our communities to see what they can do in this trend of change. What is there for them in these changes and what it means for them as people who are actually or who have been living on the land, and for the future generation who is also going to live in the land that was once theirs, but maybe once they become the next generation, they would be living in a land that is now taken away by another person. So for us, it has been a struggle that we are going through to try and see what are the best practices that our government and developers can do to help in a way, especially to actually provide for the social security of women and children. So I think that's what we've been doing ever since.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Michael, just to give us your take on the topic, with your corporate and humanitarian background, you've got probably a number of different perspectives and points of view, I imagine, but can you tell us what you think the key issue is, please, with what needs to be considered when it comes to these large land acquisitions?
Sure, thanks, Alana. The other point you missed out, corporate, but I'm also a sheep farmer by training. I do this because I live in Melbourne, but I'm a Western District sheep farmer, and in weather like this, I miss it, being in the yards, drenching sheep in pouring rain. I think if we look at a couple of issues, when you are a farmer, and the agricultural industry in Australia is if it's guilty of one particular thing, and perhaps globally as well, it's sometimes not articulating as well as it could how importantly it sees sustainability, not just environmental sustainability, but social sustainability as well. Because if we look at the title of today, Land, Hunger and Human Rights, as Kelly has said, the amount of food being produced by the world at the moment, you said a world that produces enough food, but those needs continue to increase, and that the image of hunger continues to be present and continues to grow at the same time as that demand continues to grow. So I think the big issue is, first of all, how do we take advantage, how do we use the situation we have in a world of increasing volatility in trade, volatility in sovereign risk, volatility in prices, and volatility in climate? How do we balance that with where the demand is inevitably going to come from, but how do we also make sure that the issue of human rights, the social responsibilities in agricultural communities are going to be there, the responsibilities of governments are going to be adhered to as well, and that the agricultural production can continue to keep up with what the demand will be whilst protecting the rights of the smallholders. It is a very fine balance, and I think as we go into some of the detail that Elizabeth will talk about personally and that Kelly's been involved in a lot, we'll see how we progress towards achieving that balance.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you all for the opening salvos. Now, it's not really a debate, but I like imagining it's, you know, a little bit exciting. Now, can you just tell us a little bit, any of you, what are some of the factors that are contributing to this rapid increase in these large-scale acquisitions that Kelly alluded to? What are some of the, Michael, you look like you might have something to say, just in terms of what motivates developed countries to go, particularly to developing countries, to purchase large tracts of land?
It's an interesting one, and you point on developed countries to look at these large tracts of land. Where are we seeing some of the examples of countries, and particularly whether it's sovereign funds or particular countries looking to tie up land? I'll look forward to hearing what Kelly says, but if you look at some of the particular countries which don't have the ability to feed themselves, in Australia we export, if you look at our major commodities, we are the biggest exporter of what we produce of any country. But take other countries that have to put in food security plans because they have no hope of feeding themselves. They're some of the ones that have the main incentive to invest in these particular places and to develop in these particular places. The other thing is, if you go back to about 2000, the whole issue of ethanol. I mean, ethanol is a fascinating point in this one too. Ethanol's existed since, I think, since the Neanderthal man left some fruit outside one night and then ate it the next day and got a bit of a high off it and discovered it turned into alcohol. Henry Ford ran the first Model T Ford off ethanol, but America discovered ethanol in about 2006. And it really was about then that you saw the prices of all these commodities start to go up. You saw the whole issue of countries start to get worried about where they were going to gain their food supply from. You remember, I think it was about 2007, some stores in America put restrictions on how much rice you could buy. And food suddenly became not only priced beyond what the market fundamentals should have been, how much was actually there, you could still get enough, but became a valuable commodity. So you had two sources, to come back to your question. It was coming from countries seeking to tie up their own food security. If they felt there was a chance they would be cut off. And it also came from the commercial world as well, seeing, right, there is finally value in this agricultural thing that up until now we haven't understood or cared about that much. And it really was, we are still at the start in some ways of that whole process. We're only 6 years beyond 2006, which is why a discussion like this is so important before the process becomes entrenched.
Thank you. And I know that one of the impacts of this interest in biofuel crops, commercial crops, food as commodity, is that they're usually monocultures, aren't they? Now, these are very different from traditional crops. And Elizabeth, I'd just like to ask you your point on that, or your point of view on that. You come from a place where culture is based on subsistence agriculture, where you have a variety of different crops, livestock, farms that are very multifunctional. What changes have you seen in terms of the impact of industrial agriculture or large-scale agriculture like the palm oil plantation you referred to before?
Thank you. One of the biggest changes that I've actually seen is that because land has all been given away and people in the communities are not well informed of this change that is going to take place, they are now questioning, where do we get our food? Where do we buy it? And where do we go next? Because our land has all been taken away, and specifically because yes, people do make gardens and they get food from the gardens, but when it is a time when gardens do not go well because they have not followed the right season, there is always a place to still continue and their living. They go into forest and they collect from the forest. But now all the forests have actually been gone. And so people are actually looking at where do we get our next lot of food for our people and the communities. And a practical example that I've actually just seen it over Christmas when I went home is that every man, young men, women, mothers have actually moved to the oil palm to go and work. When they came back to the village, there is no food on the table because there was nobody left in the village to do gardening, to provide for what they should have when they come back from working in oil palm plantations. So that is one big issue that communities are now facing with food security. Yes, there's plenty of land, but who is going to tend to these gardens because everybody is taken away to work on oil palm plantations to earn a little bit of money to go to school for school children and for mothers to pay for healthcare services and school fees.
Thank you. I wonder too about access to water rights. Is that an issue in Papua New Guinea, considering that when you acquire land, you usually acquire water?
One of the practical issues that have actually happened to our people in the communities depend on rivers and groundwater to collect, to drink, cook, and bath. Some of those rivers are now polluted because One, we have logging code of ethics, we have good environmental laws, but there is no monitoring. Who is there to monitor to make sure that what is happening on the land doesn't go into the river? A practical example of one community, before I came here, they had to go to court, leaving their community 6 hours boat trip to go into the main town to stand before the court, because they've actually stopped a logging who is polluting the river. They've actually tried to get rid of the logging from their land because they have seen that the river has been polluted and there was no one there for them to support them. And so the policemen actually come in to say, yeah, you have actually broken a law. You've actually stopped the logging and you have to pay a lot of money to repay what this company have actually put into your land. So what is there for the people? They have to stand in to say, yes, we do agree that we want development. What is left for us if our water is polluted? Our water that we have actually depended on for thousands of years to drink from and cook from and wash from.
And Kelly, have you experienced, from Oxfam's perspective, with your projects in so many different countries, have you noticed specific cases and perhaps cases where these problems are being dealt with in a positive way? Sure. In terms of water or just access to land in general?
Thanks. I mean, I think it's worth sort of just taking half a step back and building on some of what, sorry, what's happening here? Michael and Elizabeth said, in that I think that one of the things that's driving the land grabs is a scarcity of natural resources, so a scarcity of land, a scarcity of water, a scarcity of carbon, a scarcity of fossil fuels. And I know that the chairperson of Nestle has said that land grabs are not about land, they're about water. Now, I think they're about both, but I think it is worth noting that water is scarcer than land, and by 2050, we'll probably see about 4 billion people who don't have access to water. To answer your specific question about Oxfam's work, we work with communities in countries in Africa, in Indonesia, again, a lot of palm oil plantations, and from the small conversation I had with Elizabeth, sounds similar beforehand, 99-year leases, communities not involved, jobs on the plantation, but, who puts the food on the table, are the wages enough to pay? We also have worked with networks in Indonesia who have actually challenged their own government around when regulations come into being that has been to protect investors. They've challenged that and recently have got a fairly good court ruling to say that for something to be in the benefit of the community, there's a number of criteria that has to be met. So also, we've worked with partners in Cambodia who have taken cases to the International Finance Corporation, which is essentially it's a mediator section of the World Bank. It has an ombudsman, and we've seen as a result of, and there are a number of cases in Cambodia, it's complex, but in one particular instance, we saw the World Bank suspending loans to Cambodia until certain criteria were met. So we work with communities that are working on many levels. We work with communities who have had some successes, and we work with communities who are yet to have successes. We've also seen communities forced off their land, and one case in particular, which I'm not at liberty to speak about, is currently being mediated, and that's in an African country.
And a common theme seems to be, as Elizabeth said, and as you said, Kelly, there doesn't seem to be a great degree of consultation with local people, and they don't receive sometimes a great deal of information about what's happening. Can you shed a little bit of light, Michael, on from a financial institution perspective, on whether there are many guidelines around how large land-scale acquisitions can be carried out?
Okay. And I will qualify this by saying I work for ANZ at the moment. ANZ's work in agriculture is primarily in Australia, but having come from previous banks, Rabo particularly, which had a lot of work in Asia and Africa, so some background in that. Are there criteria for this kind of thing? I'll take it back. In 2008, for any of you who've ever been to New York in about October, I think the UN General Assembly meets, and part of the point of the UN General Assembly meeting is so every government can try and out-motorcade every other government, and all the New Yorkers can get grumpy about how it shuts down the whole city and the traffic and there are snipers everywhere. And the UN loves it and the rest of us who live there hated it. But 2008, on the edge of the General Assembly when all the presidents came in, there was a sort of unreported gathering, relatively unreported, Kelly might know about it, where representatives of a number of governments and their agricultural agencies sat down, representatives of bodies like the Food and Agricultural Organisation, a number of the other UN bodies all sat down together, and basically I was also there as a representative of the sort of commercial world in a way, and the corporate world. And the aim of that meeting was basically this, to say with that discussion, right, how can we look at a framework being set for investment guidelines? Basically, is there discussion on the formalisation of how we can, not so much restrictions, but ways that the corporate world can be monitored in what they're doing here. It was a fascinating meeting because so much of it was about, and representatives from everyone from the Chinese, the Japanese governments, African governments, America, Australia, was watching a number of governments basically eyeing off other countries where they saw potential agricultural development would happen. What came out of that? And something I'm sure we'll discuss in the rest of this, not that much formally so far. It is an ongoing discussion. It is something where a formal framework is very much still being discussed in the UN and other places. And I'll wrap up in a sec. But as far as something like a financial institution like the one I'm in, if it was looking at a project like that, what would be, say, 4 things that would really impact how much it looked at investing in the locals, the local landholders? It would be the current existing and the growing amount of regulatory issues, laws, whether they be European laws, American laws. It's an area that people here have a great amount of expertise in, that really restrict how much financial institutions from developed countries can invest in these places. And that's why so much of the investment in this in questionable places is shifting to, say, sovereign funds and perhaps other developing country banks, which are less applicable to these. Part of it is a financial return. Obviously, it has to make sense, and long-term, and I go back to the farming part, it has to be sustainable. Things cannot be long-term sustainable in agriculture unless they have social cohesion, human rights, and the involvement of all players in the value chain. Agriculture is not a short-term program. The third part of it would be the role of stakeholders, whether it's shareholder activists, the media, interest groups as well. And the fourth part that needs to be acknowledged for an increasing amount of, I'm not an apologist for a number of financial institutions, but increasingly from the developed world, if it is not right, they won't go near it. And without, as Kelly's talked about things she can't talk about, I've seen some big global agricultural policies which fit all the guidelines, which match up to all the certifications, but particular banks have said, no, it's not, it just doesn't seem right, we're not going to go near it.
So a lot of accountability and responsibility needs to be taken on the part of a lot of actors. In some cases, people have been known to overthrow their governments over this issue, as in Madagascar a few years ago. Kelly, what do you think? Do we need a global governing body that enforces these extraterritorial obligations for countries and corporations to do the right thing?
We certainly need more than what we're seeing now, which is a raft of essentially voluntary mechanisms. I mean, we have, and I'll go to one of the things that we, I think needs to be more prominent. I mean, we have OECD guidelines, we have, as you mentioned in the beginning, the UN's voluntary guidelines on land tenure that have just come into place. I talked about the International Finance Corporation, the Ombudsman. So there are a range of mechanisms under international norms, but they are voluntary mechanisms. They do not legally mandate, except in Indigenous communities, the notion of free, prior and informed consent. And this is a really important principle that time and time again in developed countries, in developing countries, it's ignored. We need to see that implemented. We saw, and that needs to be a matter of law, not a matter of principle. We also saw the UN look at a special business and human rights framework, and that was under Professor John Ruggie. Some really amazing steps forward, but again, not enough. Needs to be international regulation, needs to make it mandatory. A lot of the principles that we're seeing some good progress on now. What we're seeing now is good, it's progress, it's just not enough.
And before we go over to some questions from the audience, I wondered, Elizabeth, could you just tell us a little bit about what you think in terms of the Papua New Guinean government and what sort of response you've had at the Wide Bay Conservation Foundation in terms of support for your initiative?
Thank you. For support from the government, we have very good laws, and we have the best constitution that talks about all the things that we have talked about. The problem with it is the best processes to actually implement all the policies and the laws that we have in place. How do we do it properly? And how can we do it in places where we are, specifically at the community level government, that is where most of the population are, and that is where most of the land are, and then looking at it at the provincial level, where there are rights given to them to actually protect their people by coming up with policies that protects them from being abused or from having people just coming into the communities and doing anything that they want. But it is that our communities do not have the capacity, especially in governance at the lowest level, to do what they can do for their own people. And then at the highest level. And then you look at the bureaucrats. And then you look at all other people. There are so many things that are actually entangled in everything that we try to do. So for us in Wide Bay, we've actually tried to work with our local level government and work with other stakeholders who are actually doing or contributing to development in our own local communities and saying, yes, we have an obligation to do for our people. Let's sit down and talk about what we can all do, what you're doing, what I'm doing, and hand in hand, how can we move forward to actually supporting the one person that needs to move or needs to actually get something from us. We are not going to give them something, but we need to help them to understand what is happening in these changes that are coming into us and participate meaningfully so that they can have and continue to sustain their lives on the land that they actually have lived for thousands of years. So it has been a struggle, and it's not difficult for a smaller organization with only 5 people struggling with all these things.
Alana, I'm wondering, before we go to questions from the audience, if I could make also a brief observation that I think Elizabeth may also like to build on. I think that it's important too that when we look at the issue of land and land in communities and land grabs, it gets really important to look at the gender nature of land and of land grabbing. It does not affect at the community level men and women in the same way. And when we look at land, we look, it's an issue of there's unequal gender power relations and there's unequal access, often by women, to assets and productive resources. And we often hear in communities that, that land is marginal land, that land isn't being used by anyone. Well, guess what? Women are using that land. They're getting their firewood from that land. They're getting medicines from that land. They're getting material to mend their houses from that land. So this is not marginal, degraded land that nobody wants. This is actually people's lives. And you often see that this land, so women's land tenure is less secure. So you often see that this land is often traded away first. So I think maybe it's useful when we're talking about this to also reflect on that. And I'd be interested to maybe hear from Elizabeth what experiences, if there's been different experiences for men and women in the communities that you work in, on some of the impacts that you've been talking about this evening.
Yeah, I think there is one important... Hello? I think this is one important factor that I have not mentioned. It is that in my traditional society, we own the land. And I have the right to pass the land on to the next generation, my children. And so, while we are actually landowners, in this changing society, we become helpless because we are not being informed and we are not being taken into the circle to actually see what happened next to us and the land that we once depended on to put food on the table. And so for us, it's a big shift for us, so that at the end of the day, we have become observers on something that we have actually depended on, so that our male counterparts have actually taken the role to go negotiate, to go sign agreements without letting us know. But at the end of the day, it's us, the women, who are actually being affected by what is happening. So for me, practical example for me is, what I've done is say, uncles, brothers, this is my land, and please give me time and give me the right to stand in and say, I will make the decisions, whether you like it or not. This is the land for my children, and I, as a women will make decisions with you on how best we could be able to develop it for ourselves and our future generation. So for my case, that is what I've said. And we have an area of some 153 hectares put under reserve, under wildlife management area for the purpose of my clan.
Thank you. Now I'd like to go to the audience for some questions. We'll put the lights up a little. And there are. So if you'd like to ask a question, please make your way towards one of them. I hope we have a question or two.
Hi, I've actually got two questions. My name is Ben Shepherd. I'm a PhD candidate here in the Centre for International Security Studies, and I'm writing a PhD dissertation on this very topic. I have a question for Michael and a question for Elizabeth. Perhaps the question for Michael first. A little bit of background to this question. Michael, obviously you've heard Elizabeth's experience and what Kelly was saying. I was in Cambodia and Ethiopia last year doing fieldwork in both countries, and I saw, as a result of foreign investments, both financial speculation investments and supposedly food security investments, communities dispossessed of their land, families going hungry, families evicted at the wrong end of a gun, and conflicts between local authorities who are acting on behalf of the investors and the poor smallholder farmers, and it was all fairly distressing. As a man of power and influence in that financial world, I would like to ask what you are going to do to prevent this kind of stuff happening, and what you can do. Do you want me to ask the question for Elizabeth and then sit down, or answer one at a time?
We might let Michael handle that one.
Sure, it's a good question. Thank you, Ben, and I'm flattered that you think I have any influence at all. Look, it's interesting examples too, because in my previous life in things like the UN and the Red Cross, I have some familiarity with some of the projects you're talking about, I think particularly in Ethiopia.
Gambella region particularly.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting example. One of the things I've talked about is the fact that a number of these particular circumstances we're seeing, whether they be in Ethiopia, whether they be in Tanzania, whether they be in Cambodia, Indonesia, other places as well, are increasingly coming from other parts of the developing world, or particular countries who are using their sovereign funds or using their own resources, not going through the developed commercial world to put these projects into place. And if it's the Ethiopian one I'm thinking about, there was another particular one there that was looking at producing rice for a particular country, and there was, after a lot of investment, nothing coming out, and some huge difficulties on the ground. Your question was, what can let's say a Western commercial entity, what role can be played in this? That's the difficulty. For particular Western investors, whether they're commercial investors or particular governments, the role can be, particularly in a time of tightened funding in the world, to basically say, no, the role would be, we will not be a funding conduit, we will not be a provider of financing to something that is unethical in whatever way it may be, that is irresponsible, which does not basically fill these basic tenets for the smallholders, for the community, right through the sustainability chain there. With a circumstance like that one, where are the particular pressure points? Can they be played through people like me, an agricultural researcher, putting forward that there are particular issues with this? Yes, pressure there. Can it be played through organisations like Kelly's as well, putting pressure and highlighting these issues as well? Long term, these are difficult circumstances to deal with right now if there is not a bank or a financial institution in the middle. Going forward, as there is an increasing need for this kind of funding for these, and this is medium to long term, I think it will be easier for institutions like Western banks to play a role, because they'll be able to say, no, these are not things we're going to fund, or if these are going to happen, and I relate this back to one of Elizabeth's point, these will only be funded not just if they meet official certifications or official guidelines out of particular bodies, but if they go far further down, that they are monitored regularly, that we make sure that they match at all levels. In the short term, it's an issue. It's a big issue, because if there is not a bank involved, then there is a difficult amount you can do. And I'd be fascinated to know your thoughts on that as well.
Oh, you can join us for dinner if you like.
Thank you.
The question for Elizabeth is, Elizabeth, I was very interested to hear what you were talking about before, about how your community wants to sit down and is trying to sit down with investors and outsiders and what have you. I'd be really interested to understand whether, if you look at the situation before the palm oil plantation and the investor came in, and the situation now, whether there was actually a role for an investor that could have been more productive for your community. If the investor had come in from at the early stage and said, how can we help improve your productivity and you grow things to sell, and what kind of things, if anything, could an investor have done in approaching your community differently?
Thank you. Firstly, if someone had come in and said, what do you want? I would have said, yes, this is what I want. That is good that you're asking me, because I will tell you what I want, so that we can both work together to meet what I want, and maybe on the other hand, you would also benefit. The true story is, in 2008, the people in the community were shocked that there is already a developer in the community getting ready to clear up the land and plant oil palm. So what will the community say? the communities are so remote, they do not understand the changes that have actually happened, because someone has been taken from the community into the city and have signed papers without letting his clan members, both men and women, understand that there was going to be something here for us. And then having to go through a government system that our communities have actually trusted to protect them and their land. Going through them to come and get people to sign investigation forms without helping them to understand the purpose of signing forms and telling them why, how, what is going to happen tomorrow. So it's so difficult that when it came in 2008 to 2010, the land is cleared. So what will the community say? It's quite difficult for a remote community that doesn't know what is happening at other levels to go into these changes, hoping to benefit as much as they can, though they are losing the land that they've actually once depended on. But they have to go into it because they want to see what is so-called development, a change from community development to economic development. And that is a force, that is an impact that is forcing people to say, yes, we want you to come in and work with us, without actually saying, yes, you want to help us, come sit with us and tell us, what do you want to do with us? So that we can understand you, and you can also understand us, and together we can make consensus. Because in that way, our social security can also be protected, and you can also gain profit from what you get from our land. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And can I ask the next speaker to reproduce his excellent example by introducing themselves, but perhaps not ask 2 questions. You PhD students, you never let a chance go by. So just 1 question, please. Thank you.
I'm Monique Ungo. I work in the corporate world, but I also am very involved in permaculture, so in the not-for-profit world. And before I ask my question, I would just like to take the opportunity, Michael, to make an observation on your response to Ben's question about how, yes, banks do have the opportunity to say, no, I won't want to invest. And you're with ANZ and Macquarie Bank, both of whom it took a lot of mucking around for the community in Australia to tell ANZ to have the balls to not support the pulp mill in Australia, so in Tasmania. So you guys had the opportunity, and it took a hell of a lot of work because you guys didn't want to say no on your own back.
I knew this was going to be a debate.
My question. From a friend of mine's PhD, he had a beautiful quote in it. In theory, practice and theory should be the same thing. In practice, they're not. When you talk about the FAO, the Food Agriculture, whatever, talking in New York about what you can do about, formal guidelines and all of this stuff, that's the sort of the top-down approach. I guess Elizabeth's talking about more about the bottom-up approach. I'm not sure exactly who's in the middle and how those two interact. With permaculture, we talk about small and slow solutions rather than big investment coming in. How do they interact, the top-down approach and the bottom-up? Where and how do they interact?
Great question. And the pulp mill, I won't start by saying that I was sort of in Brooklyn at the time. But look, I mean, but that's a really good. I'm going to go back to your Pulpmere one. That's and I wasn't in the country for it, but if that was the case, and if community activism makes things happen, then all the better. And that in a way leads into the second question. As far as the activism from the bottom and the structures at the top. And I am going to pass this along to Kelly in a way too, because it's a query that I had about things that Kelly was talking about. How does that happen? Well, far from a perfect situation. The fact that structures like, when was that, the UN one that I was sitting in was back in 2008, 4 years ago. Kelly's talking about the slow pace that these kind of structures take to evolve, and at the same time, whether as Ben's talking about things he's seen in Cambodia and Ethiopia, things that are impacting Elizabeth are continuing to happen. It is a slow pace. It is these UN bodies, bodies such as Oxfam, bodies such as World Vision. Interesting, there's a new player that I think we need to bring into this, who are bringing some sense of empowerment, and love them or hate them. It's bodies such as the Gates Foundation, who firsthand, if you're looking at some of the things happening in Africa, and the Buffett family, I mean, it's just two examples where the giant global corporate dollar looking at these particular projects is basically saying we're not satisfied with the progress that is being made in terms of building up the livelihood, the strength, the resources of the smallholders, maintaining their position as well, and we will contribute to that. We will become part of that process. And I'd really have to say the Gates Foundation, for example, having spoken to some of them, bring in some fantastically progressive ideas as how to bring a voice and how to bring strength to some of those communities. Not working for them in any way, but it's just been fascinating to watch that. It is this slow process of these particular two parts coming together. The smallholders, go back to Elizabeth's example, and we might ask Elizabeth about this as well. How can some of these global NGOs, how can some of these entities bring a greater voice there? Increasingly through forums like this. And I will go back to a point I made before. We are at the start of this particular, let's call it, if we're going to call it a land grab phenomenon. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's like we're on the cusp of a wave. It's like a lot of us who look at this have been saying, there are some things happening, there are a lot more about to happen, there are a lot more about to happen, which is why this kind of discussion is important that it happens now. It's important that the pressure is maintained on government and other entities to get those guidelines into place before we sort of see big examples happening in countries which are difficult to go back from as well. Can I, with your permission, pass this on to Kelly? Sure. Because I was interested in Kelly's response before, and we wanted to get some debate going here, so let's do that. I was interested in Kelly's response in terms of, I think Alana had a question, should there be a global set, should there be a global body almost monitoring this, and Kelly used the word law. I think you used the word law. How can entities, how can particular players involved in the land grab be subject to particular laws? How do you balance that with the concept of sovereignty?
Okay, there's a few questions in all that. I'll do my best to be succinct. Great question, by the way, around Monique, around top-down, bottom-up. In our work, we support both. I'm a really big believer in there has to be action at the local level, in local communities, but that also obviously has to feed up and be reinforced into global standards and norms. Global standards mean nothing if they don't translate to change on the ground. And change on the ground in one area doesn't necessarily translate across industry sectors or countries unless there's a mechanism by which to do it. So I think, you know, one of the things that I don't know a lot about permaculture, but like local solutions, I think it's really important. In this instance, we're talking about local solutions to a problem that is in fact globalised. To go to your question, and I might actually also make a brief observation on Ben's as well. To go to your question about sovereignty, I mean, we do need to see international I think I use the term international law or international standards, and we do need to see those in place. They in no way violate national sovereignty. Human rights trumps sovereignty issues most of the time. So it is possible. I mean, obviously there has to be negotiations. Obviously it is a lengthy process, but it is possible to see laws in place globally that respect human rights, that both governments in developing countries as well as in developed countries and investors and financiers would be bound by. And I think one of the problems is that with the voluntary mechanisms, we're not actually seeing that. And I think one of the other issues that I think is really important when we're talking about investors, and I mean financiers, not necessarily just you, where there are a wide range of financial institutions, I think we need to start looking at a principle somewhere along the lines of stop, review and prove. So stop the land grab, review the involvement of the communities, and then prove that the communities, that people are not worse off as a result of this investment. And I think we also need to go to transparency of contracts and transparency of risk assessments by financial institutions and by investors. Because if we're saying, and I believe you when you say that this doesn't make good commercial sense and this is not something we should be doing, I think one thing that people who have their money in super funds or in banks or whatever might want to ask is, well, can you prove to me that you are not involved? And if you are involved, that, you know, human rights haven't been breached. And we definitely, you know, that goes to that question of, you know, how do you know if something is ethical or unethical? Now, we have our own moral compass, but then that's not enough, because we need to be able to measure that according to some sort of legally binding standards. So, thank you.
I know Michael would love to reply to that, but we're going to go to our next question, I think. We can come back to the end, because I'll ask each of the speakers at the end to make a closing statement so you can make your point then. Third speaker, third question, please.
My name's Felicity. I'm doing Human Geography Honours at the School of Geosciences at the moment. A lot of the case studies that I've kind of been hearing about lately, particularly in sort of Southeast Asia context, have been more a case of the interests of local elites within the countries that have kind of been involved in the dispossession of people from their land. In particular, there's been a case recently of a demarcation of national park boundaries within Laos that resulted in illegal encroachment into forest becoming legalised, whilst other areas of smallholder subsistence farmers becoming illegal, that what had previously been legal. What I wanted to ask is, what role is there for Western governments, for like international non-government organisations and the global community in general, to try to influence and bring about change within sovereign countries? You know, you've got elite interests within the country themselves. It's really an issue for the government of the developing countries. But what role is there for, you know, the global community to try and sort of influence these? Like, I know there's the bottom-up approaches, but when you're in a context where there isn't freedom of media, you know, a lot of that becomes very difficult, especially when people are fearing for their own safety. Yeah.
Would you like to direct that to someone?
Maybe Kelly? Whoever's... Sorry.
Sure. Look, I don't know the specific situation that you're talking about in Laos, but I don't think that's essential to offer some observations on your question. I mean, I think that you do have situations in a lot of developing countries where you don't have, you know, media freedoms, or there are other restrictions on people's rights. So in that context, what is the responsibility of the international community? I mean, I think first and foremost, it is the responsibility of the international community to support brave people who do try to take action in those countries and to stand in solidarity with them. if for whatever, and there are a number of reasons why that may not always be possible, and this is where I see that there are a range of different mechanisms and pressures that you can bring to bear, and we're probably all aware of those. But this is where regional bodies and global norms and standards, sort of legal redress mechanisms or mechanisms that say this is what needs to happen can offer some, although albeit often you can have the law, but it's whether it's implemented or not. So this is where I see you have to work on a number of different pressure points, if you like, to try and bring about change. But look, it's complex. I mean, I spent a lot of years, and this is a little bit off the topic, so I'm not going to say too much, but working on the issue of labour rights in China. So, it is a complex, that these questions are complicated, but you generally find, people that are working on these issues that need support, solidarity, protection, and instruments that they are able to use, as well as friendly governments, etc., from the region. So thanks for the question, and I hope that gave you some insight. I'm sorry I couldn't comment specifically on Laos.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
We have a question here on my right.
Yeah, Philip Ruddock, I'm a federal member, and I do have some questions about the nature and extent of the problem that has been articulated. I have no idea from the discussion that we've had about the extent to which it constitutes a major problem in terms of quantifying the amount of land that is being acquired, nor identifying the sources of acquisition. I've heard some of the references to sovereign funds. One of the issues that is of concern to me is that there may be people involved in these acquisitions over whom we have no influence at all. Particularly a lot of the investment, as I understand, in Africa is coming from China. I don't know how we're expected to deal with those issues, and I ask myself the question, if you were trying to influence somebody like me, where would you be asking me to direct my attention? Is it in AusAid? Is it the governance arrangements? Are we talking about... I mean, a lot of the decision-making that occurs in relation to these questions, I think is influenced by factors that we haven't talked about at all. They've been implied. But how do you deal with corrupt officials who are essentially being paid off in relation to the nature of the developments that are occurring when countries have no capacity to be able to deal with those issues? How are we going to influence those governance arrangements? Is it through AusAid? Is it through the UN? I mean, I think it's just as corrupt as any organisation that I've heard of in terms of the way in which it employs people and staffing arrangements and so on. I'm not convinced that's where you would find it. Nor am I convinced that the people that you might be concerned about would be happy for you to be influencing those matters, which would inhibit the investments they want to make. So my question to each of you is, can you quantify it? Is it something that is of such an order that we have to be devoting time and effort to it? And where do we do it? Do we do it through AusAid? Do we do it through our international engagement? You would help me if you were able to answer some of those questions.
Would someone like to tackle the scale of the problem first of all, perhaps?
Do you want me to tackle that?
I know, I read your report today and I think you can answer that.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Ruddock. In terms of quantifying the current scale of what's happening, where and this is part of the problem, goes to my issue of transparency. In some instances, it's very hard to definitively quantify. What I can tell you is since 2000, we're looking at 70 million hectares that's been confirmed and cross-checked. We could be looking at up to 203 million hectares globally. So that's the kind of, and I stress that this is not something you can just easily find out about. This takes a lot of research, and there may well be a lot more that I don't know about, or that we don't know about. So I think that's a very important question and a very important first step, and that is that we see transparency in these land deals, in this forced acquisition of land, and I'm not talking about legitimate investment here, but that we actually see transparency, so we know the full extent. We know anecdotally what's happening. Well, we know the numbers from our research. We also know from our work what's happening in communities, but nobody can tell you they understand with any degree of surety, they understand the full extent of the problem. So transparency is a very important first step. So I think that answers what you asked me about the extent of the problem. I'm happy to talk a bit more, but let me allow you to ask the other panellists.
Thanks, Kelly. I would like to know what Elizabeth thinks in terms of, as one of your closest neighbours, this is a very good point. What do you think Australia should do as a neighbour, very important and close neighbour in the Pacific region? Do you think that Australia should intervene in any way, and how might Australia assist somehow in this problem that you face?
Firstly, I'd like to say it is very, very difficult for remote communities to connect to institutions or even to networks that can be able to actually hear and learn about issues that communities are facing, so that then we can be able to share to you what we're experiencing like today. So firstly, it's this gap between communities and other organizations out there who are actually maybe struggling in the same issue but are not connected anyway. So that is the first thing that I'm seeing. The second thing is, yes, Australia has been giving a lot of money to our government. And when you go back to transparency and where the money is really going to, do HOSAID or Australia really know where the money is going to? And where is it, in which area is it hanging? Is it really filtering down to people in the communities? Or anyway, how do they prove that the money is going right down to support us in the community? So I'm actually looking at ways of how HOSAID can actually monitor and find out if their money that they are supporting us is actually getting down to helping communities. And secondly, for my government, I think my government is responsible to make sure that we have plans in place to actually sustain projects that are funded by Australia. Instead of just giving us money, do we have the capacity to sustain, our government to sustain the projects that are funded by HOSAID? That is another thing that I've been looking at and I've been struggling to find answers to, in terms of sustainability of projects that are funded by HOSAID. Secondly, in terms of really monitoring and making sure that the impact of fundings that are coming from Australia is really having on people that are supposed to be given to or to be facilitated or to actually benefit from. So that is one way that I'm actually just thinking of.
Thank you. And Michael, would you like to respond to any part of Mr. Ruddock's question?
Sure. I suppose and we're down on the stage looking at some wonderful lights here, but it's still very hard to see where anyone is. Your question's absolutely correct, and I've made the point before about if the particular arrangement is between an accommodating corrupt government and a well-financed government keen to take advantage of it, what role can we play? I won't disagree with you at all about what you said about the UN. Having worked there, it was the most nepotistic, frustrating, but rewarding place I've ever worked. But I gave many years at the end of my life will come off for the amount of stress I put into that place. I mean, take a few UN examples or WTO examples rather. We've been waiting for World Agricultural Trade Talks out of Doha to be finished for the last 11 years now, haven't we? The UN has some wonderful gatherings. I know that Kelly goes to some of them where a whole lot of proposals are put forward. I'm sure you've been to some of them and nothing happens. It is a long process. If there is one particular forum that we as Australians, for example, could have some influence there, is it through government? Is it through our own government putting pressure where it identifies, where community pressure or its own knowledge identifies a particular injustice, a problem happening in the land acquisition in a particular place, and then puts indirect pressure on that? And even that, how much attention is going to be paid by some of these particular governments? It is a slow process. It is a frustrating process. It is a process that just needs to continue to be highlighted, but it's not going to change overnight.
Thank you. And we are running out of time, but this man has been very patient, and I'd like to invite him to ask our final question.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Proctor. I've been working in international development for about 35 years, the last 20 of which have been in foreign investment policy. I want to make a comment to begin with, then lead on to a question that comes out of that. My experience with foreign investment policy is that most countries, the area which they protect most closely in terms of it making it most difficult for foreign investors to get into is agriculture. And I think that then leads on to what we've just been talking about sweetheart deals between sovereign funds and governments, about investors, whether they be local or domestic, having deals with governments to get things which they aren't entitled to. So what we're really talking about here is what Elizabeth has mentioned to some extent, or to a large extent, which is governance. And again, if we're talking about top-down and bottom-up, what's in the middle, as far as I'm concerned, is developing country governments, because the agencies, whether they're the big banks or the multilateral financial agencies, are at the top trying to exert pressure to improve governance, improve regulation and these kinds of things. The people at the bottom are doing what they can, but it's the people in the middle, it's the developing country governments that aren't responding. And so I think it's very difficult to see the way forward other than to keep pushing for better governance and transparency in the governments that are involved. My question, though, is I find I'm not disputing that there's a lot of land grabbing going on. I just hope that we're not using such a pejorative term to apply to all large-scale investment in agriculture, because I'd like to think that there are some positives in that, and I thought I might ask the panel, if we look at it not land grabbing but rather large-scale agribusiness and new investment in agribusiness, do you see some positives?
Who'd like to start?
I'll start. Thank you, Andrew, for the question. I'll go back to that point in the title of this whole forum, hunger. Now, we can all throw lots of stats around, but I think there's one particular stat that says the amount of arable land that has increased in the world over the last 40 years by about used to be the game changer in providing the food for the growing population, the population that, whether we like it or not, is going to change its diet. Even if we're seeing red meat per capita consumption going down in some developed countries and sugar consumption, it's certainly going to go up a lot faster in a lot of others. How do we use that investment to, once again, meet in the middle, to increase the productivity, but to do it at a sustainable rate, and also to make sure that those current social structures aren't fractured as well? And that's the I mean, it's a big argument in this country, obviously, for anyone who reads The Land, the Weekly Times, or even the mainstream papers as well. This whole debate about foreign direct investment, this whole debate about investment by Chinese, Middle Eastern interests as well. Here, I love your point about restriction of foreign investment. You'd be well aware that until the last couple of decades in Canada, not only could outsiders not invest in agriculture, you couldn't invest across state lines, across provincial lines. So bring it here, a nasty Victorian like me wouldn't be able to buy a farm in New South Wales, until relatively recent in Canada. In America, you can't build corporate agricultural entities across state lines up in the Midwest. In New Zealand, I think it's 5 hectares is about the limit after which you need government approval. It's relatively easy here, and that's part of the debate. But as far as the point, we have to lift productivity, and we have to do it in a long-term sustainable way. And while there are these big issues that we're debating tonight and talking about tonight that need to be highlighted, this is a positive that we need to be able to harness.
Thanks, Michael. Now, if our speakers don't mind, we are supposed to finish at 7:30, and I know a lot of you need to get home in this bad weather, so what I'd like to do is just give everybody an opportunity to have 1 or 2 sentences just to highlight what they would hope to leave with you tonight on this topic.
Thanks, Alana. So, I mean, I think one of the really important things is that you've come along tonight, learn a bit about the issues, or maybe you know a lot about the issues. Really important that you talk to others. Look at where your money is in your superannuation funds, in your banks, and ask questions about the policies of the organisations, and look at some of the campaigns that are happening. Oxfam has a Grow campaign. IWDA and World Vision do work in this area. Look at some of the campaigns. You've heard Elizabeth talk about the work that she's doing, and support those however you can. And you may also like to look at where there are, programs and projects happening by the aid agencies here or by others, and contribute to those as well. So that would be it from me. Thank you.
Elizabeth, what would you like to leave people with?
Thank you, everybody, for coming and be part of this night. What I'd like to say is this. We all come from different cultures, and we depend on in different ways to earn our living. The important thing is we all need life, and the life is what we are here for, and we actually have life because it has actually started from the land, that things have actually come out from it to give us life. What I'm trying to say is this, that what is done on the land is shared equally, and that none of us go hungry, and not our children are hungry, and that the people who are here tonight, we have a responsibility of future generation, and that the generation is left behind with a world that is rich for them, and that they have something to make their dreams come true for a better world for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michael?
I was going to say we should go on longer so we could hear more of Elizabeth's experiences. It's been enlightening to hear some of the issues that have been faced by you, and I think to lead into so many of the questions, if we were to combine some of the things that Elizabeth has experienced in her community, things we've heard about in other communities as well, the current buzzword is food security. The current things that we're reading about in terms of agriculture are where's the investment going to come from, where's the food going to be produced, how's it going to be produced. I'm glad we're all talking about it. I'm glad we're all thinking about it. I hope we can all keep being open-minded and seeing all sides of it, but also that we can know that at one end of the whole food security chain are communities like Elizabeth, so when we go forward with anything we eat, anything we buy, anything we do, any activism we have, we're able to be conscious of what's happening and any role we can play in it.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank the audience because you've been very attentive and you've asked some excellent questions, and I think it was a very stimulating discussion. I think it was very appropriate as the 51st One Just World Forum. And the conversation is not over, clearly, so you can keep tweeting using that hashtag, please do. Secondly, you can go to the foyer and meet some people at the tables and find out more about the event and fill out some forms that are on your seats and return them to give us some feedback, because we do read it and listen to it. And finally, on behalf of One Just World, thank you very much to our guests, Kelly Dent, Elizabeth Tonye and Michael Whitehead. Thank you.